on in our fiscal policy work and in the report, and one of them is just the maintenance factors of these models.
Yeah.
And even that's not an easy thing, because you look at historic budget trends, but then you also look at enrollment trends, and everything we've seen so far is really tied to enrollment. So there's definitely some more clarification I think we're going to need to get from the AIR team about how they developed some of their indexing methods. So even something simple like that.
Iris was definitely asking that question, I think, at our last meeting, saying, how does this get updated? And Dave, you had some good thoughts on that.
So, but it's,
what, there's no, one of the things I think it'll help the commission to know is that what we're putting together, what we've studied, is not a static enterprise. It follows on what you just said, Dave, that in every state, including Massachusetts, which seems to have kind of got quicker to a balanced decision in '93, they've had to revisit their formula on balance regularly. And so I think, to some extent, we're not going to, the commission won't be speaking in a way that is intended to be permanent. It'll be to identify some principles that need revisiting regularly by the legislature. And certainly, so that makes it a little easier, at least in my mind, because we're not trying to isolate the perfect answer that can never be changed,
Right.
We'll go with enrollment changes, with curriculum issues, with the rise up of technology. Everything will be fluid,
Mm-hmm. But I think,
imagine if Amazon moved into Claremont. What would happen to their property tax base? My whole reason for being would be undermined.
So yeah, all right. So I think we're still waiting for Dick and Chris. And Rick Ladd's not going to be able to make any of the meetings today. He emailed me earlier, so. Have we heard anything from Dick or Chris, Jordan?
I have not heard from them.
Let me just ping him real quick and see if.
Oh, here's Chris now.
Oh, Chris is coming in.
Yeah.
Let me give Dick Ames a quick call. Hey, are you coming in on? All right, great. All right, we'll see you in a sec. All right, Dick is en route. So why don't we'll get things going here. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for your time on second time this week. We'll call to order the meeting of the Fiscal Policy Work Group. It's October 22nd, 2020, a little after 10 o'clock in the morning. And as we do at all of our meetings, we'll get things started with a roll call of our members. And so I'll start it off. Dave Luneau here in Hopkinton with Ozzie the long-haired dachshund. And I see my neighbor, John Beardmore.
Morning, everybody. John Beardmore, also in Hopkinton. Families around the house, but I'm alone in the room.
Okay, thanks, John. And Mary Heath.
Good morning, Mary Heath here in Manchester, and I'm home alone.
Okay, and Chris Dwyer.
Chris Dwyer in my Portsmouth office, and I'm alone.
And we've got Bill Ardinger.
Hi, everybody, in my law office in Concord, alone.
Great. And Mel Myler.
Mel Myler, calling from Port Clyde, Maine, and I'm here alone.
Okay. And Dick Ames.
Yeah, I think I'm here.
Yep, you're right there, Dick. Perfect timing. So thanks. And we've got,
Thanks.
great. And we got Jordan Hensley.
Yep, Jordan Hensley here in Dover. My fiance is also in the house here.
Great, thanks, Jordan. And Rick Ladd's not going to be able to join us today. And I think Bruce had also indicated that that he's tied up this morning, but will be joining us at 1 o'clock for public engagement. I think that's right.
I think so. Yeah, him and Carrie both had an event with the Endowment for Health this morning. So
Right. And then I think yeah, so I think the schedule for today is fiscal policy 10, public engagement 1, and adequacy at 3. So anyway, how are we looking as far as access is concerned, Jordan?
I think we're good. We've got 7 public attendees with us and have not heard any issues.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for our public attendees for joining us today. And I think we'll have a good discussion on a couple of major topics, which I think are on the agenda, which is sort of a digestion of the Massachusetts Chapter 70 presentation that we heard last week, what we think about that, what sort of questions might come out of that. And then I think we want to pivot over to property tax relief programs and what we've learned about those through both the DRA's presentation and the presentation from Daphne Kenyon back in July, and how we might be able to move forward with property tax relief and deferral programs as part of a comprehensive school funding recommendation. So anyway, we'll start it off with the Massachusetts Chapter 70, and I'll just sort of open it up to what do people think? What do people think is interesting about it, and what sort of lingering questions do you have with it? So, and I'm not suggesting that we're endorsing this, but just sort of understanding, the moving parts, which really seem to begin with a mandatory minimum local effort, followed by a state grant to round out the foundation budget, which I think the state of Massachusetts pegged at. What was it, Dick? Something like $12,500 per pupil. Obviously,
Yeah, I think that's it. It's a little hard to track. In FY19, I know it was 11,400 or 500, 11,500. So then you go into 20 and 21, and it changes up. How much exactly? If for some reason I didn't seem to come across that number.
Yeah.
now
I thought she said somewhere around 12 to 13,000.
yeah, I thought you gave that range. Yeah.
That's good enough for our purposes to know that.
So yeah, I think it's good enough in the aggregate when we talk about per pupil cost. But the other thing we've learned through this journey is that costing is very specific to the student needs and the characteristics of the community the school serves. So did we get into how Massachusetts goes about building up their total estimated district foundation costs with the sort of differentiated components to that?
Well, I don't know. Well, she spoke about that a bit, but not in detail. But I think the truth of it is that this is a 20-year plus or minus effort to zero in on costs and what are the drivers and how do they relate to student needs. And this most recent amendment to Chapter 70 reflects work that I think began around 2014 or 15. There's a commission in 15 that reported, and it's an effort that is, to use our phrasing, clearly input-based in terms of looking at costs, the various components of cost that go into providing an education and relating those to perceptions of performance. I don't know exactly how they do the relationship, but the outcome of it isn't dissimilar, at least in its core elements, from where we are at. I mean, the low-income children get in their calculation a big boost in money, and so too for special education and English language learners, which is a much bigger population in Massachusetts than here. So they work all those elements in and come to a formula which drives their foundation budget. They call it a foundation budget. They also interchangeably use the word adequate, by the way. It's not as if it's rejected. It's the foundation budget is what is required to provide an adequate education. I've seen that language. But foundation budget is sort of the core term. And so they arrive at a foundation budget that goes from a high number for a place like New Bedford to a low number to a place like Weston. And the same pattern develops too, because they don't have a lid, a cap on what Weston can spend, being a high wealth district. So Weston spends, according to some older numbers I have, somewhere around $28,000 per pupil. And I don't know where New Bedford is right now, but they have the same, they still have that kind of difference because there's no cap at the top. And they also have some hold harmless provisions that allow places like Weston or Wellesley, Representative Pesh's district, to sort of get some level of state funding. And so there's that element in there, which she described as a politically based element, not educationally based, to make it all come together in a sufficient way to get support in the legislature.
I thought it was interesting when she talked about the incentives to get this passed. And she talked about, you mentioned it, Dick, the hold harmless, the sped money and transportation money, regional inflation increases, and the wage adjustment factor. I thought that was an interesting political thing. Did I hear her say that there was a 7-year transition period? So the question that wasn't answered, I don't think, was how in that 7 years do they buffer the issue of the intervention of legislative initiatives that might interrupt that particular plan? Was that addressed? I don't recall her addressing that.
Well, I
Okay.
think we talked a little bit about Massachusetts has been at this for a long time.
Okay.
And it seems that they have a much higher level of statewide support that everybody has committed to on a bipartisan level.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you think back on what Alice was saying, it goes all the way back to 2000 when Duval Patrick really got this whole initiative started for education, and they embraced it as a state. The other thing I just wanted to mention quickly, I did reach out to Aiden and I asked him if he would send us the research that they've done on establishing the minimum mandatory levels. So hopefully he'll get that to us soon.
On that note though, Mary, one of the things that I think we're going to find out as we look at the survey today in depth is the really lack of understanding of school funding in our state.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at those who responded to the survey, there is a dearth of understanding about how. And so it may be prudent upon us to really begin to think about how we begin to at least
Yeah.
explain this process to people, particularly those who are going to be in the legislature next year,
Yeah.
and not just presume that because we put out some shibboleth of recommendations that it's going to be totally understood, that there needs to be kind of a foundation built so that regardless of where you come out on the topic, there's at least a common foundation of understanding of how the current system works and some of the things that we're going to be talking about as a result of our study.
I think that's right, but I also think something that Massachusetts has done over the last couple decades that we have not done is they have built up great confidence that their Department of Education is really on top of what is happening, and they are, and that they are conducting research, which they are doing all the time, about schools that are performing better or worse than expected. They have enormous systems of support for those schools. They've built a lot of confidence in the public that they are using those monies really well. Those monies are going to education, and the results show. You know, I would say in my own experience, I never feel when I'm in a Massachusetts school that, you know, I'm necessarily in an outstanding school, but across the Commonwealth, they have built a floor under those schools that used to be a school that you'd go in and say, no, I don't want my kids in here. They have done a tremendous amount to let the public know what they're doing and then to do it. And I think if you look at the public comment that we've had, it's all over the place. You have people who think that our schools are terrible. They have no idea that we have some of the highest performing students in the country overall. We don't have an image of where we are in education. And so I'm not sure how much people other than legislators need to understand the mechanics of the system, but they need to have confidence that the monies are being monitored, spent well, and that they're producing a product.
Excellent point, Chris. Excellent point.
The other
Go ahead,
thing
Bill.
is the authority of the Department of Education is much greater, and they're able to really facilitate those kinds of changes and be held to those changes if they don't meet the standards that they're supposed to be getting to, which I think is something, and there's a level of trust for the Department of Education in Massachusetts, which we're really missing here in New Hampshire.
So that's one of the things I think we definitely want to talk about. I'm not sure it's going to be in fiscal policy, probably inadequacy, is the accountability element of that. And you know, given the fact that the path we've taken is basically outcome driven, you know, we're not going to get to state average outcomes or some, you know, some element of state average outcomes overnight. It's going to take several years to get there. And how we go about monitoring progress towards that, and then and how we go, you know, what steps are taken to help districts, you know, in terms of accountability. I think that's going to get pretty complicated. And
I just would like to add with that, David, is that I really think New Hampshire needs an Education Reform Act like what Massachusetts has done, so that we're really looking at the total picture of how we work and what we expect, and really think about that PR aspect, because you're right, New Hampshire is doing really well, but there are so many people that don't understand that at all.
Now in Massachusetts, and I remember when we were talking with Alice about this, were we we're at an NCSL event last year, and she seemed very clear that school funding and ed reform are two very, very different things. and so I like how you've just sort of laid it out, that if we're going to look at reform measures, that's another effort, you know, to follow on this one. So Bill, sorry about that. Yeah.
I wanted to follow on Chris's point about, and Mary's too, that as we think about what a report looks like, you know, I think of what I do in like Congress on federal tax reform, federal tax bills. The report always starts out with current situation, reasons for change, proposal, and effective date, which has transition rules. And I agree with Chris. I'm stunned at how little people who should know about it really have a sense of where New Hampshire is as a state, where, you know, that in general, on average, it's got some pretty good good performance levels, but, you know, and in certain areas, it's got issues. And I think that our report could serve a very, very good role if it would start with a description of current facts and current law that, you know, we could accumulate into a summary that the members of the commission could all agree on, or, you know, that reflect what we've heard. Because I think, Mel, back to an early meeting we had, and we were all meeting together still then at the BEA, and up on the screen, and I think it might have been AIR, they showed something that said, here's Massachusetts state share, here's Connecticut state share, here's New Hampshire state share. And I remember Mel reacting saying, whoa, yeah, New Hampshire is the lowest state share. But I'm surprised that Massachusetts and Connecticut also have low state shares. And I think it's important to get those facts out on the table for either school funding and for education reform. Right, Mary? You can't really go into education reform without knowing what is the current state of play. And, you know, I would just strongly urge a very good beginning of the report that focuses on here's where we stand currently against basic measures.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Bill. So Bill, something that wasn't clear to me when we were meeting last week with Alice and Aiden was what the Mass 70 funding plan will look like in FY28. And you know, this is the first year of it right now, FY21, the school year that we're in. And I remember Alice being very clear, saying that yep, they funded it in their budget, 1/7 of because they were phasing it in over 7 years. And she said 1/7 of the cost has been put in the
additional cost for the
new funding model.
Right.
So I guess we sort of know what that looks like in FY21 because we've seen the presentation on that, and we know that the foundation cost of that is, you know, somewhere between $12,000 and $13,000. The foundation cost is picked up in some combination of local property taxes through the mandatory minimum, and then state dollars that follow that. And I guess what's that going to look like in FY22, FY23, and FY28? Does the mandatory minimum change? It seems like the state dollars are going to change because she said 1/7 in this first year. But you know, Chris, do you have? Or
I
Bill,
I've found no analysis and projection as to what the future relationships will be. Right. Moreover, when I asked her the question, did you think about percentage shares as part of constructing the overall solution? She was pretty clear in answering, no, we really didn't think about that. So I don't know that there is a projection out that far.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting you bring that up too, Bill, because, you know, you sent me over, news story that you pulled that came off of NCSL this morning.
Yeah.
And which is very interesting, quoted Daphne Kenyon, and inside it there was a link to the report that she had presented to us back in July, and so it was good to sort of refresh myself with that report. And in the report, Daphne actually recommends against picking a state versus local share.
Yeah.
I mean, she mentions it several times in that report. So,
I mean, I think it doesn't have to be state versus local share doesn't have to be a particular outcome that's targeted in policy creation, but as a matter of fact, it does come out because
it comes out, right, right.
You know, you're able to see that in terms of comparisons, New Hampshire has the lowest state share at 32% right now. And I think that's it's a relevant indicator of the level of delegation and the mix of financing.
Right, right. So yeah, it's not a design factor. It comes out in the end. Right, right.
And you know, this may be a little cynical, but in our model, both parts can be labeled state share, because whatever the one thing I learned early on this commission is that whatever the state says is state share, and the state tells you to raise X amount of money, that is state share, right? If the state is defining it, that is state defined, therefore. And so, yes, it's all coming eventually from local, but it's state one plus state two.
So is in Massachusetts, is the mandatory minimum considered part of the state share?
Well, no, because that's Massachusetts. But if we were to look at something like that, we could think of it as, you know, what we now have as state, what you're at, plus what you have to do locally.
Mm-hmm.
I think Dick has been very articulate on trying to understand whatever rule exists, and you know, let's not call it first and last dollar rule. Whatever rule exists, Chris, the question is, would it effectively render the Massachusetts solution? If we adopted it whole cloth, would we run afoul of that rule? And I don't know the answer to that question. I thought Dick described it pretty well.
So going back to Massachusetts, they you know, they've got, at least in the first year, they've got that foundation amount between $12,000 and $13,000 per student. It's more specific than that. It's got a base component plus differentiated factors. So, but on average, once you add it all up, that's sort of what it comes down to. And then I think from the presentation, and Bill, correct me if I'm wrong on this, that the first dollars towards that come from the mandatory local minimum.
I think that's a fair characterization. I think they have both of them working at the same time, both the mandatory minimum and the Chapter 70 aid are kind of fitting, but if you were building a spreadsheet and their spreadsheets do this, they figure the mandatory minimum first.
Yeah.
And,
I mean, you got to,
and then they back into the Chapter 70 aid as the amount that is required to get the district from their mandatory minimum total to their foundation budget total.
Right. And so that mandatory minimum has an element of fiscal capacity built into that.
Right.
On both income and property wealth.
Property, right. and their equal contributions. And that's where, when I went back to look at the Lincoln Policy Institute and saw that study that had been done in our state, that the correlation between income and equalized valuation is 0.11, not 1.0, but 0.11. It really underscores the importance, and that's a New Hampshire figure, really underscores the importance of us having to think about that.
So you know, and so that's a really good point, and I think it's something that and this is, even though we're going to be talking about in property tax relief later, but in the Lincoln Institute, in Daphne Kenyon's report, she talks about targeted property tax relief programs to the specific to taxpayers, as opposed to
Right.
cities and towns as a whole. So
Right.
as opposed to making an EVPP based grant, save up that stuff and use it as targeted grants through a low and moderate income property tax relief program.
Can I add a couple thoughts to this?
Please, John. Yeah.
Just as we're talking through the mandatory local contribution, I kind of take a different approach to it than, I think about it differently than Chris does, although I appreciate her point of view. I think in New Hampshire, based on the way I've seen I've worked with AIR's model, I'm not inclined to be supportive of a mandatory minimum. I'm not seeing what tax policy benefit it accomplishes. And I'm concerned that it trips on, or could trip on, something I don't think we've talked about too much, which is the 28A issue. And I'd be interested to hear what Bill thinks about that. You know, I'm not, you know, I've always struggled with 28A because
Right.
Cities and towns are political subdivisions of the state. And, you know, my background's totally biased, 15 years working for the state, but I kind of take the point of view that states created the locals, states can kind of direct what the locals do. But 28A says we can't do that. So if we're going to say
That's the parental view. I brought you into this world.
It's true, Bill. That's exactly what it is. I brought you into this world. I could tell you what to do. And we do in so many ways already, that folks sort of are blind to the 28A angle, I think.
But isn't Massachusetts doing something about it? Don't they have a hook through the foundation grant dollars that follow the mandatory minimum?
They might. I don't totally understand the Mass formula. I haven't studied it enough. I just, for our conversation, I don't see. You've got two choices. You do a big state property tax rate, or you split that rate into two. And I've not seen the magic of splitting it into two.
Mm-hmm.
And I worry that it does a few things. It creates confusion to the point we were talking about earlier, that people do not understand how education policy and funding work. And I don't blame them. It's tough to get your head around. It's a lot of time. But I think having a mandatory local state tax rate, a state tax rate, a local tax rate to your heart's desire, above and beyond adequacy, I think adds a layer of complexity. And we need to be moving in the other direction.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of my takeaway on that. Unless somebody can show me really from a policy perspective, and maybe it has something to do with the so-called donor town issue,
Mm-hmm.
but I haven't seen it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that Massachusetts representative said it was an important political piece, and I think in the history of what happened in those first years of how the money was spent in local places, that the donor towns would have a a considerable concern that there was some skin in the game, both monetarily and with educational will to improve conditions. So, I think it serves. It may not be policy in the way you're talking about, John, but I think there's a political element to that. That's
Can
big.
you break that down for me slower? How it
Well,
addresses?
I think it's important that all towns, particularly if there's going to be some additional, and I don't know how we're going to get away from either individuals based on their income or individuals based on their property wealth contributing relatively more in some places than in others, right? Based on the disparities that we see. So to know that the local body has committed to a certain amount of resources and that they are spending them on education, I think that's what was described for Massachusetts. And I think that would be important for us too, because, other towns are going to be spending a lot more of their local dollars. So to know that every community has some commitment to that, which I think we have reason to question.
Well, I think maybe it just comes down to point of view, Chris, because as you kind of mentioned that folks pay more based on where they live, I think right now, how we've addressed the so-called donor issue, taxpayers in property wealthy towns pay less because of where they live. And they effectively get a property tax subsidy from the state in lieu of the state dealing with a difficult policy issue. And I thought it was really telling that Representative Peisch, is that how you say it? Who's from Wellesley, effectively said, gee, I think Wellesley, my words, not hers, I'm paraphrasing, but I think Wellesley should get less. And, New Bedford should get more. I'm obviously, making up the town, but, to me, that flies in stark contrast to what we've heard from Waterville Valley and Newington and respectfully Portsmouth repeatedly.
But Don, it's because they take income into account in how they figure those things out. And if you look at the Lincoln Policy Institute and you look at the report that Phil Sletton gave us, you see why that's true. Because they have that other piece of it. You can't just take two parts of this. This is algebra 2. You got to take all the variables working at the same time. So if you don't have other call it circuit breakers or haven't taken other things into account in making those decisions, I think you would have a very different perspective from those communities if you knew that you weren't losing all your young families and you weren't losing all your older people because of that pressure.
Well, my perspective is pretty different than yours. And I don't think property tax rates in Waterville Valley are the reason why young families leave. And perhaps Waterville and Portsmouth are materially different towns, probably so.
Right.
But, I, for one, I think it was said in the last meeting, nobody wants to bring donor towns back. I don't like the word, but it's shorthand we've come to use. And, I, for one, don't see a problem with it. What I do think, and to Dave's point earlier, we probably should follow Dr. Kenyon's guidance. And if we're going to ramp up the state property tax materially, and we're going to collect it statewide and not give Waterville Valley and Newington grants just because they're property rich, and recognizing they've got income poor people, surely, we ought to have a real robust targeted property tax relief program. And just from my perspective at working at Department of Revenue, it's probably going to be a shot in the dark in the first instance, because we don't know what the demand is going to be out there. We don't have income mapped to property value. We don't,
Right.
nobody has that. We do have income, we do have property value. We're never going to be able to put those things together. But if
Right.
we launch a program with a 20 million, I'm just making numbers up here, $20 million, $50 million appropriation that we think is really, really sufficient, then we can dial it in downstream.
I think language really matters here, and we have to stop pretending it's as if the towns, somehow an entity called a town pays this. Individual people pay these taxes,
That's very
right?
true. That's
And
absolutely
so
true.
if we can think like that instead of starting to label this town and that town, and any look at like the data that we were given shows that immediately.
It's interesting what John has done, and I don't think I had put it together as clearly. You have the property tax base, which just like any other tax base has pros and cons to it. And then you say, well, how do I dress the base to try and mitigate the cons and enhance the pros? Well, one way has been we're going to relieve the pressure by offering automatic rebates. If you live in a town and the total amount collected by the town exceeded a number, you get an amount back. That's the excess property tax problem. Really, it's very related. That problem is very related to individual taxpayer relief. In some sense, it's a substitution. And if you had to choose which is the better piece of tax policy to address the actual problem of low income, low net worth, low cash flow taxpayer, it would be, as John says, it would be the tax relief, the taxpayer relief mechanism. It would not be to kind of like put some kind of circuit breaker for people who live in a town who may be wealthy, and not paying, as John, and I'm not putting words in John's mouth, and I gotta, but they're maybe not being viewed as paying their fair share statewide. So the right, those are two alternatives.
Mhm.
And it seems to me, if, as just a matter of logic, if the commission were to really focus and come up with a really lovely, well-structured property taxpayer relief program, that the concept of excess property tax or donor town should be dropped. That just, once you're getting to the problem directly, you don't need the indirect thing. And I thought the way John linked those two is it actually sets off a bright light. I think that's a good link.
I appreciate that, Bill. It was totally accidental and it'll never happen again.
No, it wasn't.
But I think you need to focus. We also need to remember I agree words matter, but the rebate, let's call it, the act of allowing, I'll just pick on Waterville Valley because it's easier than Portsmouth, because nobody from Waterville Valley is sitting right in front of me. But the act of letting Waterville Valley keep that excess was not an act of trying to target property tax relief. It is a property tax. It behaves like a property tax relief program, but that's not why it was created. It was created totally arbitrarily. You've got 30 plus or minus towns that benefit from it, and it was created solely because we raise property taxes and we aggregate that. The taxpayers pay it, as Chris said, people are paying it, but we aggregate it by town, and then we the state are using that bucket of dollars in Waterville Valley as a credit against what we, the state, owe Waterville Valley for just one program, adequacy aid. And as I've said before, what we could have done is said that education aid is not only going to fund adequacy, it's going to fund school building aid, it's going to fund special education aid, it's going to fund tuition and transportation aid. For whatever reason, we didn't go that route, and we said to appease the people in these 30 or so towns, we're just going to let them keep the cash and they'll be quiet politically. And so far, for the last 10 years, they've done so. They chirp up in certain policy debates like this one, but in 2010, I know because I was there, they were pretty loud. and consistently loud. And so that was a policy response to really just appease a certain group of folks who live in generally property wealthy towns. And it did nothing to target property tax relief specifically to low income people all across the state with state dollars. So for that reason, I don't mean to pick this fight repeatedly, but it's been sort of a component, or it was a component of my professional career for 10 years or so, when I was a budget analyst for the LBA office, and when I was a budget director for a governor, and when I was a tax commissioner. You know, this issue has been with me all along, so I've thought about it quite a bit. And I just don't see the point of view of the Waterville Valley folks. Perhaps I would if I lived in Waterville Valley. I certainly know why their politicians support that policy outcome. I would demand it of them probably if I lived in those towns, but I don't. And
So what I'm hearing, John and Chris and Bill, is I guess very similar to what we've done on the school side, that not every kid is identical to the next kid in the classroom, and not every homeowner in Portsmouth is identical to every other homeowner in Portsmouth or Waterville Valley or any other place in the state, or in Hopkinton or in Concord or Bow or Pittsfield or any place. And so I'm hearing sort of a strong preference towards low and moderate, and maybe even putting a higher, you know, obviously including low, but including moderate, targeted property tax relief programs are better than sort of providing blanket relief on a city or town by town basis.
1,000% yes. I would also support a homestead exemption. I mean, I know we've toyed with that idea. You know, I think that accomplishes somewhat of the same goal and could be easier to administer.
Okay.
But I think what we're talking about here is really, I think the idea we just talked about from a standpoint of this is an individual issue. It's not a town issue. And I think what John is saying is that it really changes the entire focus of this conversation to really looking at each individual taxpayer rather than a collectivity called a town. And I think that's key here.
Well, Mel, if I could chime in here. You say it's not a town issue. And I say, but it is a town issue. In reality, it is an issue for Waterville Valley, for Portsmouth, for Hanover, for New London, across the state, every place that has high property values, and that is considered under the current system as an aggregate for purposes of the amount collected. And the picture painted by those towns, because it's a town issue, is that their money is going to support activities in some other place. And that's where the excess comes in. John has consistently made the point that it won't work to turn this into a tax like the rooms and meals tax, where the money is collected locally, not exactly, but let's say, and then it goes into a statewide pool, and then goes to whatever that the state considers needing of that money. The money that would be collected from the statewide education property tax would be collected locally, aggregated locally, and then shipped out, which is a very different story. So it's taken the shape of the town, and that's where you run into trouble. And so, conceptually, I'm all for a pure statewide education property tax, where individual taxpayers are the ones that are paying it. Of course, that's the way taxes work. And if and all of that money would flow into the state treasury, and then it would come out according to the state's determination of need. And that's the way tax works. But the problem that we've got is that is the reality that it is aggregated locally. And maybe we can go to a $7 statewide education property tax, or an $8, or whatever it takes to make the formulas work. But that $8 is going to be collected locally, and the reality is that that's the way it's going to play out. It's going to be very difficult to get anything passed because of that reality. I'd love to get away from that, but I'm told we can't, and I've come to accept that in terms of the aggregation locally. Yes, we can have it shipped to the state, which would be different from the way it is now. That seems to be something that could work, so that's a good step. But it's still it will be viewed as local money, and however magnanimous the people in Waterville Valley might be, they'll see it as in a way that will work against success for this formula, I think.
Can I respond to that?
Please do.
I appreciate your advocacy for the state collecting the property tax, and I don't mean to be totally dismissive of it. I think there is.
John, let me interrupt. I didn't advocate for it just now. I spoke of it.
I know you did. You have in the past, right?
Well, not really.
Yeah, we had this debate earlier this year. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll choose a different word. Considered it. I don't disagree. There would be certain benefits from the state collecting the property tax. My view on government generally is that the biggest government should centralize services for the most efficient use of time. But I wouldn't want to pick a fight with the Town Tax Collectors Association and have the state collect all property taxes. You could do that. I think one issue with that is that the math would still be there. This would be a tax that, unlike all our other taxes, is publicly known. And, the folks who are good at Algebra 1 could still do that math after doing a right to know request of the Department of Revenue. If you'd even need to do that, Revenue would probably publish the data. But I think if we went to a more robust property tax relief program, or even a homestead exemption, you could calculate the value of that for each town, such that perhaps some towns that are so-called donor towns now, if they really do have a critical mass of low-income folks living in a high-income area, or a high property value area rather, perhaps the value of that individually targeted property tax relief would swamp the so-called donor give back of that town, however it's calculated. So I think you could transition to a case where we could say, hey, Portsmouth, you put your money to where your mouth is, and you advocated on behalf of your low to moderate income folks. And guess what? This program actually targets Portsmouth really well, and Newcastle's still a donor town because the folks who live in Newcastle actually do have high income in the aggregate. So, I think it could work.
That's a good point.
So this has been a really good discussion, and John, I thought you brought up a couple of, many good points, but one of them was started to sort of scope out the magnitude of a property tax relief program currently that's getting about $1 million, I think, a year of use. And I think, without having put a finger on what a statewide property tax would be, but that a relief program would have to be in the you sort of started at 20 million to 50 million, but 100 million, it's in that sort of meaningful range. It's not a $2 million program. It's a significant program in order for it to be meaningful and provide value for not just people in Portsmouth or Waterville Valley, but also for people in Pittsfield and Hopkinton. Bill, is that, and I think you and I have sort of just talked one-on-one of, bigger than a breadbasket, smaller than an elephant. What's the size of a program, a meaningful property tax relief program?
I think two things. Number one, it obviously is not working now. If you read out there like Daphne Kenyon's work, it says New Hampshire's is not working. That is on either our version of a circuit breaker, which is low income housing relief, which is in the Education Trust Fund, or the deferral program, which I had a great conversation with John Tobin, who's worked with the current deferral law. So neither one of them are being used. So obviously there's a problem. And I think that points to, and I may, sadly, I just found out, have to get off around 11:15. So I wanted to say, number one, it's going to have to be a larger number. I think the BC report indicates that the number has to be larger. And I believe it's got to be funded through state budget dollars, because it's a matter of incentives. If you are telling the towns to help get the word out and, to people who are eligible for the program, you cannot say, and every time you're successful, you'll lose property tax dollars. It just can't be that way. And I think all of those, both of the reports you circulated do that. And what that means is the state has to step up. Now, in structuring a program, remember, these could be, at least the deferral program is not a permanent loss of revenue. It's a deferral of cash flow, which is a very valuable future cash flow that I think the state can borrow against. So I just would say that in considering this, I think we have to face the fact that if you tell towns you're going to teach people that they can use it, because you want to have a greater use than what we currently have, which is pitiful, you've got to hold harmless the town's tax revenues with state support, or else the program will never catch on. We'll never educate the people out there to the level required to have them access it. So I guess that's a too complicated answer to your question. There's two parts to it. It's got to be more, and the state's got to play that role and backstop that.
So Bill, one of the other really valuable things in Daphne Kenyon's report is she provides some examples, and albeit a little bit dated, I think the report was 2007 or something like that. As to
She's updating it now. She's updating it again.
Well, then great, because we could probably ask her for an updated state scan on what other states are currently doing. But even back in 2007, you could see how far New Hampshire was away from a number of other states with their property tax relief programs. And some of the states also had provisions for people, for renters as well, which is probably something that needs to be examined in more detail, see what other states are doing and see how something like that could be incorporated in. But Bill, you also mentioned a tax deferral program, and I guess I'm wondering, how do you see like the qualifications for a tax deferral program looking like? I think we've got, obviously some work to do to update New Hampshire's qualifications for a low moderate property tax relief program. But what do you see as qualifications for a deferral program?
Thank you for asking me, and especially I muscled my way in because I'm leaving, so I appreciate it. I wanted to comment on this, but before I left, I think one thing that was really good in Daphne's report was a graphic that showed the indirect property tax relief, the direct property tax relief, and that circuit breakers were different than tax deferral programs. I believe that it is possible to structure a dovetailed, the circuit breaker approach is a type of permanent exemption. It may be closer to what, and when John said it, I immediately wanted to jump into his brain and say, all right, what are the details of the homestead exemption? But that's a permanent exemption. It's almost like in our BET, if you don't have gross receipts over whatever it is, $50,000, you don't even file a return. That's a permanent exemption. The deferral program is different. For me, I would see the dovetail fit something like this. The permanent exemption should be absolutely limited to those who have the lowest cash flow, current cash flow, and those that have the lowest net worth, right? I don't think we should be giving permanent exemptions to people who have very high net worth, but currently are just not drawing income. This is Bill Ardinger only. Nobody else agrees with this, by the way. I'm making that it's clear.
Is that constitutional, Bill?
The answer is, I believe yes, because I'm looking at Dick, because the court has made clear that the legislature has the power to adopt reasonable exemptions and deductions. So that allows, for example, if you're blind, you are exempt from paying the I&D tax. It allows a whole host of exemptions in our system, including the 50,000 threshold in the BPT and BET. So I think it's a great question to ask. I would be a little nervous, John, if all of a sudden you said, we're going to exempt everybody on their on their primary residence. I think you'd be running into some questions about whether the distinction between primary residence and other real estate is sufficient to justify such a large exemption. But in this case, I think a very targeted exemption through a circuit breaker, and Dick Ames has sponsored legislation that I saw trying to work with the I'll say it wrong, Dick, but the levels, the eligibility levels. The deferral program can be on top of that. You can extend that deferral program maybe to low cash flow residents who have a little bit more net worth. Chris, I'm looking at Chris Dwyer. I think Portsmouth would have more cases like this in some sense, because if maybe someone had a house that has gone up so much and their sole net worth is due to that home,
Right.
maybe they could elect deferral.
Right.
And the question is, can the cost of that deferral program, Dave, so it would fit, you'd have the exemption or circuit breaker program on the bottom, or homestead type thing, depending on John's eligibility.
Right.
Then you'd have the deferral program above it. And the deferral program, the key is the pain, the fiscal cost of that pain, I think can be addressed through borrowings. Because when you defer payment, you create, if the legislation is written correctly, an automatic lien against that property, so that when the conversion event happens, whenever that is, and cash becomes available, the first thing paid back is the deferral.
Yeah.
Now, I've seen interest rates like in Massachusetts at 8%. That's crazy talk. We do not need 8%. And again, Beardmore is going to know more about these rates. He's doing it every day in his job on municipal finance rates. But I think what we could do is have a market-based rate that's reasonable. And then the state could go out and borrow one way or another, put it in a trust fund, pay out to those cities and towns who give them, completed paperwork and take responsibility for eligibility, for monitoring, that a trigger event has not happened, and for making sure the lien is properly there. In which case, the state of New Hampshire has one of the longest, time horizons. We can borrow general debt, or I'm looking at John Beardmore, maybe that we could even do a securitized debt filing here. I can think of some investment banks that would love to do that. Actually, there's a real appetite for some yield, and a product like this would be well backed. I think that's what I'm thinking is how this fits together. I think you need both.
Mm-hmm.
I think you need to have a message that's driven to taxpayers. This is about taxpayers, not towns. And through the Beardmore link established earlier, I'm teasing John a little bit with this, getting him in trouble but he's the one who stuck it in my head this morning. I would eliminate the excess rebate by town thing, because once you get to the real focus point, you're really getting to the Mel Myler statement, which is, look, it's about helping kids everywhere. And if there's some really wealthy person in Wolfboro with really wealthy property who's paying tax at 1% or $1 a thousand because of the excess rebate thing, that's not good tax policy in my view. So I think you just shut up.
No. I wanted to get this out, and I know we've only got you for a few more minutes, but why would that be preferable to just getting a mortgage from a bank and using that?
That's a great question. A reverse mortgage or something, tapping the equity of your home.
Yeah.
That is an alternative. It's available right now in a pure market-based thinking mechanism, which I don't want to accuse you of being a rabid, pure market-based thinker. That's exactly the way it would work. The option exists. In fact, my personal experience, without studying any research on it, is that there's a tremendous amount of people who are eligible, who would be eligible for this benefit, who there's obstacles to accessing that option, whether it's the market itself that doesn't make it available because of low income or other debts or credit card, or whether it's simply cultural. So an elderly person who says, I'm not borrowing, but if it's a government program that's well constructed, they might say, no, this puts me in the same boat as everybody else, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. So Chris, then Dick.
Well, I think the article that was sent out with this agenda last night, the one that I had a chance to read, does such a good explanation of the cultural barriers there. And any of us who've tried to talk especially elderly homeowners into it, have run into those. And it shares some of the research related to that, why it has to be something that might be thought of as more age related than income related, especially then given, what it takes to do the borrowing to make it work. But I thought that article was extremely enlightening along those lines.
So would that be one of the qualifications for a deferral program? Would also be, as it currently is in the inoperable New Hampshire statute, age? There'd be an age qualification for it?
Well,
No.
if you had both working together, one related to low income, one related to age, one has an income, one has call it a cultural element to it, or that article explains why it's kind of important to make it available across the board now that comes from an age perspective, obviously. But I know, to me, we have taxpayers that fall into the category. I think a lot of the donor town taxpayers who have objected in the past fall into that category of their primary wealth is in their home and they're living on Social Security. Now, obviously, that's not going to be true of everyone, but that's what's happened when these escalations where we've had 20%, and facing this year, last month, the median price of homes for sale, because of the pressure from people from Boston moving up, went up $200,000.
Yeah.
In what sold. So the pressure on property is going up very fast, and because we have to keep up with our coefficient of dispersion here and reevaluate every year in a number of these communities, it's moving very quickly. So I think the idea of having multiple mechanisms here that are targeted in different ways is really important.
Okay, good, thanks.
Yeah, can I, Dave, now, before Bill leaves, I want to ask him this question. So we've been focusing here on homeowners. That's really been the focus.
Yes.
What about the renters? If you have a significant opportunity for homeowners who are in particular situations to have their tax reduced or delayed, but you don't have it for renters whose landlords will be paying the full tax rate,
yeah,
and who will pass on most of that to the renters.
Right.
How would you treat that, Bill?
I think that's a great question. And I struggled, Dick, with this question in my role recently as a member of the Stakeholder Advisory Board for the CARES Act money, because I was thinking about property tax deferral being important to avoid mortgage defaults. It turned out July wasn't so bad as I thought it would be. I struggle with this one, Dick, because, and I've been in other areas of tax policy where you're effectively, the person who is paying the tax dollar is the landlord, but the person you're focused on as the beneficiary of the program or policy is a contractual party to the landlord, which is the lessee. And, what I would not want to see happen is a policy, and this has happened in many areas of the tax laws over the years, where the policy is sold as helping renters be able to stay in rented households. But what you're really doing is increasing the return on investment of the landlord. Now, I have drafted before in my crazy history rules that try to enforce that push down, but if it is hard to do, and it also, I think every time I've tried in similar settings to do that, I've had someone say, that's why we hate you tax lawyers, because you make everything so complicated. Dick, it's a tension. In my view, it's an absolutely important consideration. Rented households should receive some support, whether it is through a property tax relief program or, and I know we've got John Tobin, he's been listening in religiously, and he's an expert in this area. Would it be through a direct renter support program? I think that's where we ended up on Stakeholder Advisory Board.
Right. Well, that's, I think, the way to go, but exactly how to structure that is hard. And I think in Massachusetts, they use a tax credit for renters that fall within a defined group, and but they've got an income tax, so they can do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this could be a good outreach to Daphne Kenyon too.
Mm-hmm.
And to
Right.
get some parameters behind that. I know John Tobin has some things that he's seen on it, and I think it's worth probably talking with him about it, but also talking with Daphne and seeing what some other states are doing from this. Hopefully we don't have to reinvent the wheel on.
Let me just apologize and thank all of you for how much I enjoy working with you on this stuff. Thank you.
Right back at you, Bill. Thanks. It's been a good meeting today. All right. So sorry to lose Bill on this point, but I'm sure he's back to dealing with other tax issues. And Dick, did you want to say anything else about the importance of some sort of relief on renters?
Well, I think that a relief program across both the rental group and the homeowner group is essential if we're going to go with a higher statewide education property tax.
Right.
Right. And I think the funding of that has to be provided. And I think that adds to the burden that we're sort of dealing with here of that has to be borne by state revenues, some of which would be coming from this new statewide education property tax. But it does add to that burden or subtract from the extra that comes in from the statewide education property tax, however you view it. You know, I wanted to just make one, if I could back up, because we started with what about Massachusetts and how do they do things? And then we segued into this. But one other takeaway, and I mentioned this, I think in the last commission meeting, but it's really important to keep in mind their foundation budget. Is somewhere between 12 and 13,000, we think, per pupil. But we also know that their spending per pupil total is well above that level. I believe it's 125% of that, or 26% of that 12,500, let's say, figure. So it's $18,000 or $19,000 per pupil. And that's Massachusetts. So their hard commitment is to the foundation budget, and the spend above that is a consequence of local decisions, I believe. Although there's some federal money in there, I'm sure, as well. But here in New Hampshire with our education cost model, we're looking at a predicted cost to enable an average outcome for children across the state of, I don't know what the number is, $17,000 per pupil, 16,500, something like that. Very high number. And we've left open the question of how that predicted cost translates into a hard state commitment. I'm trying to avoid the word adequacy. There needs to, I guess what I want to say is that there needs to be some kind of translation or addressing of that difficulty. What is our hard commitment? And I don't know when we're going to pick this up, Dave, but
so that's actually coming out of Jay's, that's an adequacy work group conversation that has to happen there. There's clearly starting to be a blending of fiscal policy, adequacy, and everything else. So we can probably talk about it too. But something else that I think, as you were saying this, a comment that John Beardmore made earlier this morning, I think is really important too. In terms of simplicity and or not getting too complicated in all this, and so I've said at other meetings, so it's not a surprise. I mean, I'm working a couple of different spreadsheets that I've sort of cobbled together, and trying out different things, and some of them can look really complicated, and probably, that's not at the end of the day going to be something that's going to help cities and towns develop budgets and voters know what they're voting on when it comes to a budget and their effect on property taxes. So I think you're right, Dick, that whether it's 100% of the estimated cost model or some factor of a fraction of that, and also probably looking at some number of years. I don't think 7, but it's debatable. Massachusetts has a 7-year phase, and maybe we can do something a little bit quicker than that, maybe a 5-year phase in.
I suggested a homework piece for someone. I guess I'll take it on. What is that phase in, that 7-year that?
I think that, yeah, and I think if you could take that on, that would be would be great. And I think we need to find out what Massachusetts looks like, and I mean, just to understand their model. We know what year 1 looks like, but we don't know what the other years look like. Yeah. And it would be good to get a better understanding of that. And a couple other points that I'd sort of written down for today, and this is swinging back to the Massachusetts discussion, is what has the Massachusetts 70 funding model done to help schools raise the money they need to provide an education for their students? I guess because at the end of the day, that's the that's the key part, and I think Dick's question goes to that. We have an estimated cost model that gets students in every district to state average outcomes. And I think that's what we will, we're proud of our state average outcomes. I guess, is that the target? And I guess this is still an adequacy concern, or is something greater than that the target, or is something less than that the target? Because price tags can be put on all of those numbers.
Yeah, just one observation about that. So the ECM has it starts with an educational piece, and that is that it's that the goal that the AIR then worked off of is to achieve for every child that average outcome that is so good nationwide and in our region. So that's the goal. And then they've done all the fantastic things they can do with numbers, and have produced a predicted cost based on a lot of variables of what it will take to reach that outcome. So there's the outcome, that's the education piece. And that's one could say, let's say for a moment, that's adequacy, or what is an equal opportunity education for everybody. And then they've gone into predicted costs. Well, if you look at their predicted costs town by town, you'll find quite a number of towns that are achieving above that average outcome at a lower cost than is predicted. So I think it's important to understand that it is a predicted cost. It's not something that you want to put a hard commitment on. Mm-hmm. The hard commitment can be on the goal, educational goal. And then there's this predicted cost, and how then you translate that into a commitment, maybe you don't. You stick with the commitment, which is the educational commitment, and you develop state aid and local requirements, however you want to phrase those, to come up to that, to enable that outcome, but not necessarily to require for every town that they spend that much. Some towns are going to be more adept at finding the touch, the way to educate that will lead to above average outcomes, but will involve less money. And that's to be welcomed. So, keep in mind that education, cost, two different things.
So, all right. So what I'm hearing you say is that that a school's or school district's actual cost for education isn't necessarily going to be dollar for dollar the same as the predicted cost that comes out of the AIR model, and therefore giving schools some I guess flexibility to spend something other than the estimated cost model, whether that's less or whether that's more, will have some value at the local district level.
And is validated by the data that we see that ECM has produced.
Yeah.
That AIR has produced.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Chris.
But I think that's an interesting point, and the facts, as Dick said, are obviously true when you look at the slope. But it's interesting that I believe one thing that Massachusetts has then, if I'm not mistaken, requires the expenditure on education of essentially their predicted amounts. And so it would be interesting to know their discussion around that and how they arrived at that. I assume it is because they saw abuses, right? That they were trying to do the right thing and that they saw it not happening so that it wouldn't come to outcomes. I'd be interested in.
Good question. And I think, Chris, the other thing that should be part of my homework is the leeway that they do provide. I think there's a leeway provided on the cost side for school districts.
That would be very
what triggers a state audit of a school district for a parent failure to meet their obligation? Is it just dollars, or is it performance, or is it a mixture? I don't know.
They classify their schools into 4 categories. So it'd be interesting to ask if, there's different leeway within those categories depending on the performance, their accountability categories.
So Chris, when you say Massachusetts requires districts to spend the predicted amount, do you mean the foundation amount, that $12,000 to $13,000 per student, or the predicted amount, which is something closer to $20,000 per student?
If I read correctly, I think they're required to spend the amount that has been identified as their cost per student. So if, in Lawrence, it's going to be more than it is going to be in Wellesley. Obviously, they're not limited. They can spend more than that. But if I read correctly what from the website, they're required to spend that amount that they have been predicted. But that could be wrong. So I would like to, if Dick is going to follow up on that, I think that would be really interesting to know.
Just for comparison purposes, the Massachusetts predicted cost would be, say, like what we have from AIR in the estimated cost model. Those actual dollars, 100% of those actual dollars. The Massachusetts Foundation cost is something like 2/3 of that. Okay.
But remember, I think they set that as an aspirational kind of proportion, and it's aspirational. obviously that came out of discussion and negotiation, but didn't have an empirical basis to it.
Okay. Just making some notes. So Dick, are you going to chase that down?
Yes,
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to try.
All right. And while we're still talking Massachusetts, did we get any information on what they're doing as far as the property tax relief?
I mean, that's a big question. I mean, they've got credits, and I think various localities have their own homestead exemptions, and
Okay.
so I think it's complicated.
Okay. Just saying, and again, we're not taking a position on Massachusetts, the Mass 70, just trying to understand it, but looking at it from in sort of a comprehensive,
Right.
standpoint, understanding where it is now, what Massachusetts requires the locals to do, spending predicted or foundation costs, what's happening in year 1, going through year 7, and then what's their property tax relief package, and does that ramp up too?
I don't know about property tax relief, Dave, but they do cap property tax growth absent a supermajority.
That's a very
vote.
good point. Very good point.
So that has
That's prop 2.5, right?
Exactly. So
Yeah.
if you want to go above 2.5%, I think adjusted for new construction, then you've got to do a supermajority vote. And as I've been sort of saying for months now, I think one thing we ought to think about is if we're going to pump a whole lot more state aid across the state, do we want to put some type of governor on local property tax growth as one of the small handful of states that don't?
Okay, that's definitely something that I think we should. That's a clear fiscal policy question.
Yep.
Do we have a way of getting like if New Hampshire is one of the few states that doesn't have something in the books for that, is there a way to get like a 50-state scan on? There must be a report out there somewhere.
Yeah, there's got to be. I can take a look.
That would be great, John. Thanks. Okay, good. So we've got about a half hour left in budgeted time for this morning. We've already had, I think, a pretty strong discussion on the Mass 70 as well as the property tax relief programs. I don't know if anybody else if there's any other points people want to get out on the table this morning. I've gone through most of my notes that I had for things I wanted to hit.
Dave, just
yeah.
to respond to that, and this may be asking too much, but it might be helpful to do a careful side-by-side pros and cons of the pure statewide education property tax and the local minimum contribution option. Compare the two pros and cons, and we've focused in on the excess issue. I would presume in this kind of side-by-side thing that whatever one would do in terms of tax relief for particular home, low income, low property value, whatever it is, stressed homeowners and renters would be applicable on both sides. But so, why is one better than the other? Or what are the, maybe that's not right. What are the differences between the two so that judgments can be made, informed judgments as to which way to go?
Okay, let me, I think that's a great idea, Dick. And Jordan, maybe you and I can talk about that.
Yeah, that sounds great. We can definitely put that together.
Okay. And we'll have that for the next work group meeting. I think that would be great. All right, anything else while we're here this morning? I think everybody's got some homework to do. Anybody else have anything else?
On top of all the other homework that's been already assigned.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, we knew it was going to be getting to crunch time on this, plus campaign season too. So Mary, you doing all right? Okay. Mel? Yeah. All right, John, anything else for this morning?
Nope.
I really appreciate the discussion this morning. So Chris, you're good?
Yeah,
Alrighty.
this tax stuff has been really important, because I think that we, as David, you and I have talked about, this is a concomitant issue with what we've been talking about. And I'm very excited about this side of it, because as we've been talking to others, the issue of what's kind of relief we can provide for property owners as we look at these other issues is I think fundamental, because we just haven't done this. Even absent the school funding issue, this is fundamental, I think, to provide some relief for people who are really feeling the stress of this.
Yeah, and Mel, when I think when Jordan sent out the agenda for this meeting, we also included some LSRs from or some bills from the last few years.
Yeah.
In fact, one of them I think was this past session to update the property tax, low moderate property tax relief program, and even the numbers that were in there looked really thin compared to maybe what I think other states are doing. So I think it's going to be really important to get that update from Dr. Kenyon to help us with that, and so that we can work with DRA and work with Mickey and putting together some. I mean, I know we're not going to be able, as John pointed out, we know the property values and we know the incomes, but they're not in the same, database. But we can probably put some, take an educated guess on what a budget for that would be, and so it's been good to have some conversation around that this morning too.
And this really should be a bipartisan issue, because we're all concerned about this. To me, it's not a Democrat-Republican issue. This is an issue about people in our state providing some sense of relief that they've not had before. And I think this is so important.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, that'll be the last word, Mel.
Okay.
We'll see you at 1 o'clock.
1 o'clock.
And all right, everybody enjoy the day, and
thanks,
we're good.
Dave.
All
Thanks,
right.
Dave.
Thanks.
Thank
See you
you.
soon. All right. Bye-bye.